So recently, a couple times, I've seen people be offended or talk to people who were offended by the way someone worshiped in church. And we're being with Nate Brubaker and Eddie Simon and John Sutton, Keith Jacobson, a few other great guys, David Williams. And we were talking about the way one of the guys, John Sutton, really encountered in worship. He was very physically demonstrative in his worship. And I was messing with him a little bit. I was a very young believer, and it was aggressive, man. I mean, he looked like he was trying to storm the gates of hell. I mean, it was aggressive, and I liked it. But at the same time, I was like, man, that's demonstrative. You're demonstrating. This is a big deal. And so I was giving him a little bit of a hard time, not mean-spirited, but still I was touching on a sensitive, a sacred area. And Eddie looked at me and said, "Hey, you don't mess with somebody's church dance. Whatever their worship thing is, you don't touch that. That's sacred." And ever since then, I thought, you know what? That's 100% right. And have been very careful not to do that. I have another wonderful story. I was involved with Elise Cole Ministries. It was an offshoot of Healing Place. Maybe 15 years ago, 14 years ago. It was a stretch. And Brandon Holmes was at the altar worshiping. My mom used to come every so often and hang out with us. We had these little evening services called Kurikon, which is some Greek word meaning something. I don't know what it means. And I probably didn't know what it meant back then either. But it means something spiritual, no doubt, And he was at the front of the service. He was close to the altar worshiping. And he was kind of wailing out. He was kind of like, "Lord." And I had talked to him later, and he was saying, "I've just been struggling with so many things, and I feel so unfit to come before the Lord, but he still wants me to come before him." And dealing with, frustration or doubt or shame or fear or condemnation and our self-pity, and also dealing with love and goodness and grace and kindness and mercy and justice, and how it's just. God says that it's right. He says, "I am just to forgive you your sins." And it's like, no. There's no justice in forgiving me for things I did wrong. He's like, "I am just." And in that paradox, Brandon's in the front of the church wailing a little bit. Not crazy loud, but loud enough to where it's noticeable. Again, a little more demonstrative. And my mom looks at me and she's kind of, not super turned off by it, but just kind of, I don't know why that's necessary. And she talked to the Lord and she said, "Lord, why would anybody want to do that?" And the Lord told her, strong as nails, "Why don't you get on your knees and find out?" The first time I ever saw my mom in any kind of physical way engage in a worship service was right there. She got on her knees and prayed during that worship service. And out of just obedience, even though it wasn't something that was her tradition, it wasn't something that was her experience, that was what she was going to do in obedience to the Lord. And no, she wasn't loud, and no, she wasn't just like Brandon was, but she obeyed the Lord in her sacrifice and her submission to him. I'd like to submit to you that worship is commonly very, very indefinable. But if I could try to throw some words around it that could loop it in a little bit, it's a form of submission to the wonder and the goodness and the majesty of God, which is love. And in the Bible, there are, there's 4 key phrases in Hebrew, maybe 2 in Greek. I'm forgetting, but there was a handful of, I did a word study on this once. Randy Creel, Pastor Randy Creel at the church in Livingston did a word study on it too several years ago. And at the same time I was doing one, he preached a sermon on it, and I was like, wow. We hadn't even got together on it, and we found the exact same thing, was that even though many people's background was very traditional and not very demonstrative, I keep using that word, it means to be demonstrating while you're doing something, to physically move around in a way that's very overt. Pretty much every word in the Bible for worship or praise has to do with a physical action. There's throwing your hands up. It literally means to throw a stone. And we don't throw stones at worship. It's talking about pushing your hands toward heaven, like you're making a movement. There's obviously laying prostrate before the Lord. There's obviously kneeling. There's all kinds of different things, but almost every single word was a actionable word. So let me just throw this out there to you. If you see somebody worshiping with flags, and you're not used to flags, if you see somebody worshiping and they're dancing and they're spinning, and you're just not used to that, if you see somebody worshiping and they're singing louder than you would really like, understand that what you would call decorum or couth or manners might matter very little to them in the moment. Yes, they may be attention seeking, and yes, they may be shallow, and they may be looking to put off kind of a sensationalist air to where other people think they're very spiritual. Yes, that's a possibility. But it's just as likely, if not more so, that their form of submission to God's goodness has to do with what they're going through in that moment. It has to do with what they've been through in their life. And it has to do with some things you don't know anything about. And so instead of being turned off because somebody dances when they worship, or because somebody sings loudly when they worship, or somebody laughs and enjoys the joy of the Lord when they worship, perhaps reevaluate your own stance before God, because He does inhabit the praises of His people, does He not? So if He inhabits the praises of His people and you're in His presence, maybe standing still with your arms by your side is far more offensive, or far more egregious, or just plain, let's just put an easy word on it, lazy, scared, fearful, wrong, than somebody who's saying, I may not know what the best thing to do is. I might look a little ridiculous. I might look like David dancing until people call me uncouth, unmannerly. You have no decorum, undignified. Maybe, just maybe, you could lose a little dignity, gain a little boldness, and find a new submission of your own.